I was removed from my parents' will completely as my brother was more eligible to handle everything. After 10 years they want a part of what I have created on my own. I, Peter, 35M, still remember the day I was removed from my parents' will. The memory is so vivid, it could have happened yesterday. My father sat at the dining table with a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes sharp and calculating. My mother sat beside him, a cold mask of indifference on her face, as though this entire decision was nothing more than a business transaction. And, in a way, it was. You're simply not as capable as Daniel, my father said matter-of-factly, his voice devoid of any emotion. Daniel, my older brother. Their golden child, sat smugly across from me, arms folded and a condescending smirk plastered across his face. He had always been their favorite. The charming one, the responsible one, the one they believed was destined for greatness. Unlike me, apparently, the rebellious disappointment who questioned their authority and pursued his own dreams instead of the ones they had mapped out for him. Handling the family estate requires discipline, Peter, my mother chimed in, as though rehearsing lines from a script. Daniel has proven himself reliable. You, on the other hand, have always been reckless. Reckless. That was their term for daring to live on my own terms. For refusing to work at my father's law firm and instead starting my own small business. For turning down their carefully laid out plans for my life and chasing what they considered a foolish dream. I sat there, numb, as my father slid the legal documents across the table. My name had been struck out, removed entirely from the will. Everything, the family estate, the investments, and the generational wealth, was left to Daniel. They didn't even look at me as I walked out the door. I left with nothing but a few $1,000s in my savings account and a battered old pickup truck. My parents and Daniel believed I would crawl back to them, tail between my legs, once my independence inevitably failed. But I was determined to prove them wrong. And I did. Starting from scratch was brutal. With no inheritance and no family support, I was on my own. I moved to a small town, away from the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of my family's social circle. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment with cracked walls and a leaky faucet. I took odd jobs, construction, delivery driving, and working at a local diner, just to scrape by, but I had a plan. I had always been fascinated by woodworking. Even when I was a child, I'd spend hours in my grandfather's old shed, building small pieces of furniture from scraps of wood. It was my passion, my escape. And now, it became my salvation. I used every spare minute honing my craft. I saved enough to rent a small workshop and started making custom furniture. I would drive to local farmers markets and fairs, selling my pieces out of the back of my truck. It was slow at first. There were nights when I barely slept, working late into the night sanding and polishing. Some weeks, I could barely afford groceries. But I kept going. Slowly, word spread about the quality of my work. Orders started trickling in. Then they snowballed. Within 5 years, I had expanded from a modest workshop to a full-fledged business with a team of skilled artisans. My company, Peter's Heritage Woodworks, became known for its unique, high-quality custom furniture. Interior designers began seeking out my pieces for upscale homes. Retailers reached out for collaborations. By the 10th year, my company was earning millions in revenue. I was financially independent and more successful than I had ever dreamed. I had built something that was mine, without the crutch of family wealth or privilege. I was in my office, reviewing the quarterly financial reports, when my assistant buzzed in. "Mr. Sawyer, your parents are here to see you." My father's face hardened slightly, still too proud to openly beg, but my mother was already on the verge of tears. "Peter, we made a mistake," she whispered. "We were wrong." Her voice shook with what might have been genuine regret. But it was too little, too late. I sat back in my leather chair, arms crossed, as I watched my parents and brother squirm under the weight of their own desperation. Their eyes darted around my expansive office, the elegant mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows with a sweeping view of the city skyline, and the sleek, minimalist decor. Everything about the space reeked of success, a stark contrast to the deteriorating fortune they had been left with. I had no intention of making this easy for them. My father cleared his throat, still clinging to whatever remained of his pride. The man who once spoke with an air of superiority now struggled to keep his voice steady. "I know we haven't spoken in years, Peter," he began, his tone strained, as though it physically pained him to be in this position. "But your mother and I, we wanted to see you. We've been following your success." I cocked an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "Oh. You've been following my success?" I asked, my voice laced with mock interest. "That's funny. I didn't know cutting someone out of your will involved keeping tabs on their career." My father's eyes narrowed slightly. Clearly not used to being spoken to in such a tone. But he didn't have the upper hand anymore. Not this time. Daniel, who had remained unusually silent until now, suddenly shifted in his chair. His once arrogant face was pale, his lips pressed together in a thin line. He was clearly uncomfortable, and it was oddly satisfying to see him in such a vulnerable position. This was the same man who had worn smug, condescending smirks when I was cast aside like a piece of garbage. The same man who had reveled in my disinheritance, believing he alone was worthy of the family legacy. Now, he was nothing more than a shell of his former self. My mother, ever the dramatist, placed a trembling hand on my father's arm, as if she were preparing to deliver some emotionally devastating confession. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Peter," she began, eyes watery, her lip quivering slightly. "We made a mistake." I nearly laughed out loud. A mistake? They hadn't just made a mistake. They had deliberately abandoned me. Coldly, calculatingly, and without remorse. They had erased me from their lives, as if I were nothing. My father exhaled sharply, his frustration barely concealed. "We were wrong, all right," he snapped, his voice hardening. "Is that what you want to hear?" I tilted my head slightly, feigning contemplation. "No, I don't want to hear anything. I just want you to get to the point." Daniel's fingers twitched slightly as he pulled at the cuffs of his suit. His voice was strained and brittle when he finally spoke. "We need help," he admitted quietly, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. "Financial help." I stared at him for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. I wanted them to feel the humiliation. The indignity. "Help," I repeated slowly, as though testing the word on my lips. "You need help." My mother nodded quickly, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "Yes, Peter. Please. You've built something remarkable. Your company is thriving. We have nothing left." The words should have stung, but they didn't. There was no pang of sympathy in my chest. No flicker of concern. Only a cold, bitter satisfaction. Daniel, now visibly agitated, ran a hand through his thinning hair. His eyes burned with shame, but there was still a glimmer of entitlement behind them, a faint trace of the man who once considered me beneath him. "Our properties are gone," he muttered. "The estate, the vineyard, all of it. We had to sell them to cover the debts." He said it with such casualness. As if he expected me to be appalled by the notion that our family estate was lost. But it wasn't our estate. Not anymore. They had made sure of that when they removed me from the will. I let out a sharp breath, placing my hands flat on the desk. "So, let me get this straight," I said with deliberate slowness, my voice low and cutting. "You cut me off. You threw me away without a second thought. You handed Daniel everything because you thought he was more capable than me. And now, after running the family legacy into the ground, you have the audacity to come crawling to me for help." My father's face flushed with anger, his jaw clenching. I could see the tension in his fists as he struggled to control himself. He was still too proud to beg outright, but his eyes betrayed him. He was a broken man. Daniel, on the other hand, had no such restraint. His face twisted with resentment. "You're seriously going to let your own family suffer?" He sneered. His voice was dripping with disbelief and condescension. "After everything we've done for you?" I snapped. "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated coldly, my voice rising with fury. "You mean disowning me? Abandoning me? Treating me like garbage? You humiliated me and cast me out because you thought I was worthless. You never once asked if I was okay. You let me suffer alone. And now you think you're entitled to the life I built without you?" My father shot to his feet, slamming his palm against my desk. "You're an ungrateful bastard." He spat, his voice trembling with fury. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I stood slowly, meeting his enraged gaze with calm, steely resolve. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "I'm just not your fool anymore." When they left my office, I sat in silence for a long time. My hands rested loosely on the surface of my desk, my knuckles still white from the grip I'd held during the confrontation. I expected to feel some degree of sadness or guilt. But there was nothing, only a strange, liberating calm. For days afterward, they tried to reach me. My father sent lengthy emails, a desperate attempt to appeal to my sense of family loyalty. My mother left trembling, tear-soaked voicemails, her voice cracking with remorse and self-pity. Even Daniel, once too proud to admit any weakness, sent increasingly frantic messages. "I know we've had our differences, but we're still family, Peter. You can't just turn your back on us like this. You've made your point, all right. Enough with the self-righteous act." I read and listened to every message, not out of compassion, but to remind myself of their audacity. I took no pleasure in their suffering, but I also felt no obligation to ease it. One morning, while walking through my factory, I watched my team hard at work. Skilled artisans carefully carving, shaping, and sanding fine wood into elegant furniture. My employees, my people, were laughing, chatting, and working together with pride. I smiled to myself. This was my family now. These people had stood by me, trusted me, and helped me build something extraordinary. Unlike the people who had once called themselves my family, these people were loyal not because of blood, but because of shared struggle and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, my parents and Daniel grew more desperate. My mother tried to leverage sympathy, showing up at my office, crying on the front steps. Daniel became more aggressive, trying to frame me as cruel and selfish to mutual acquaintances. But it didn't matter. Their opinions no longer held any power over me. I had already freed myself from their grasp. One afternoon, I stood in the middle of my workshop, the scent of freshly sanded wood lingering in the air. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of satisfaction wash over me. I had built this life with my own hands. Brick by brick. Splinter by splinter. Without them. And there was nothing they could do to take it from me. As I walked out of the factory, the sun warming my face, I knew with unwavering certainty that I was finally free of their judgment, their scorn, and their chains. I had won.